Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Will Flower, Vice President, Winters Brothers, Waste Systems.
Well, good morning. It's been an exciting WasteCon so far, and there's lots more to come. There are 1,800 people at this WasteCon, and I wish every one of them could be here to hear Mike Cahill speak. For all of you who are fortunate enough to be here, I can tell you that you're in for a real treat. However, before I talk about Mike, let me tell you a little bit about the coveted Lawrence Lecturer Award which Mike has received. The Lecturer Award is presented to an individual who is recognized as a national or international leader and expert in the field of solid waste management. This recognition can come in a form of research, management, publications, teaching, and/or political action. The individual's contributions must be sustainable, significant, and sustained. Mike Cahill is an attorney who's spent his entire career focused on environmental, administrative, and municipal law. He's also focused on the management of solid waste and recycling facilities. Best known for winning the high-profile flow control case of United Haulers versus Oneida Herkimer before the United States Supreme Court, Mike has vast experience with solid waste and recycling. Mike did not spend his entire career practicing law. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Mike served as the president of the Resource Recovery Agency for the town of Islip on Long Island. During his tenure at the agency, Mike built 4 major waste management facilities, including 2 landfill cells, a 500-ton per day waste-to-energy facility, and a materials handling facility, plus a composting facility. You'll hear Mike, as you'll hear, Mike is a talented litigator, has argued a range of constitutional and environmental and municipal questions before the United States Supreme Court, the United States Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Mike also teaches environmental law at Stony Brook University up on Long Island. As a testament to Mike's qualifications, the list of people who nominated Mike is quite impressive and range from CEOs and commissioners to the dean of a university. One more thing I want to let you know about Mike, and that is his philanthropic work. Mike is the chair of the Evan Liblet Scholarship Fund Steering Committee, which also raises money and supports undergraduate and graduate students at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. This morning, Mike will talk about some of the most high-profile and interesting times in the modern history of solid waste management. Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure it is to introduce the 2018 Lawrence Lecturer Award recipient, Mike Cahill. Great job.
If you love somebody, better tell them why they're here, 'cause they just may run away from.
Good morning, everybody. And I want to thank Will, and I'd like to thank SWANA for the opportunity to speak here today and for granting me the Lawrence Award. A lot of people thought, or some people thought that I was, and I thought that I was going to talk about flow control this morning, but I decided after kind of being asked, how did you get into the garbage business, to talk about the Garbage Barge. And the Garbage Barge is what got me hooked in solid waste. And it is something that I think could be, that's our Garbage Barge. That's the Mobro 4000. It could also be called the SS Unintended Consequence. But it had a significant impact, I think, certainly on my life and on solid waste and recycling in general. What I'm going to talk about is how that barge got launched, who launched it, and the general atmosphere in which it set sail, and how we ended up with, and what effect it had, I think, at the end of it all on solid waste. The story I'm going to tell you, I just want to give you some background on where I got the information I got. Some of it I know personally because I was involved in it. Some of it I learned from federal prosecutors and FBI guys. Some of it came together. Some of it I knew as it happened, but a lot of it came to me over time, some years after the fact, when prosecutions were concluded, affidavits had been written, and conversations that happened years before suddenly made a little more sense. It is the story of Long Island, and in particular, it's a story of the town of Islip, which is on the map you've got there. This is a basic kind of setup. This is Long Island. This is Nassau and Suffolk counties. In the west, the three towns of North Hempstead, Oyster Bay, and Hempstead are in Nassau County. Everything to the east is in Suffolk County. There's 3 million people that live in these 13 towns. They are also the towns that overlie the aquifer that gives the drinking water for all 3 million people on Long Island. Each of these towns, then and now, is responsible for solid waste management. The counties aren't involved, unlike every place else in New York State, where the counties are the core planning units. On Long Island, each of these towns are the governmental entity that's responsible for it. I got involved with the town of Islip in 1984. I got a job as an assistant town attorney after spending 5 years at the Legal Aid Society of Suffolk County trying criminal cases. So after law school, I went into criminal law, and I learned a little bit about trying cases. I learned a little bit about what grand juries can do, and I learned to talk to prosecutors. I learned to talk to judges. But after 5 years, I realized I was forgetting everything else I knew, and so I moved out from legal aid and into municipal government. Over time, I ended up running the program at Islip, solid waste program. And in doing that, I got to learn about some of the federal prosecutions that were underway, or at least the federal investigations that were underway. For example, I found myself at one point conducting a tour of our solid waste facilities to 4 or 5 federal prosecutors or federal U.S. attorneys who were coming in to get familiar with garbage. And so I got to introduce them to point out, this is a landfill, this is a MRF, this is a front-end loader, it collects commercial waste, this is a rear-end loader, it collects residential waste, this is a roll-off truck, it collects construction debris. And as they got familiar with it, they got familiar with it quickly, and I later found out what they were up to. But there were, 1983 on Long Island, there are 3 plans to deal with solid waste. Each of the towns that I showed you before that were on that map had a landfill. Most of those landfills were unlined. A couple of them were lined, one of which was in Islip, another was in Brookhaven town. But New York had a plan. In 1983, New York State created a plan for Long Island. This is a story of the collision of these 3 plans. The state's plan was a state law that applied only to Long Island, and it was a law that was passed. It was a kind of a legislation of the moment, if you will. I think you may all be a little bit familiar with how laws get passed, but New York's land burial law governing Long Island came about in the wake of Love Canal. It was passed at a time of very heightened sensitivity to the threat posed by leachate getting out of an unlined landfill, threatening the aquifer beneath it. So New York's plan for Long Island was, you're all going to close your landfills by December 18th, 1990. You got 7 years. You can build whatever you want to replace it, but those landfills are going to close. There's no mandatory provision that says you're going to have to build anything in particular. That's up to you. But you got 7 years. The law says we're going to give you one limited expansion between now and then, if you need it, if you're going into resource recovery, and if you've got no feasible alternative. That was Plan 1. Town of Islip is Plan 2. This is Islip Town. The landfill that Islip has is just above that little yellow Islandia sign, village in the northern part of the town. And that's the Blydenburg landfill. It had been operating for 30 or 40 years. It was about a 60-acre site. 40 acres were a closed landfill, unlined, and Islip was, the landfill was operating a single cell that had been lined but didn't have enough capacity to last more than 3 or 4 more years as of 1983. Islip's plan in 1985 was to close that existing landfill and build 2 waste-to-energy plants, one in the east of the town, one in the west, and one ash fill that would have been constructed in the western part of the town. It needed a one-time expansion to complete its waste-to-energy plant within that 7-year period. Those 2 plans ran into each other head-on. When the state began to look at enforcing that law, it had to decide whether it was going to grant any of the applications that any town might make to keep landfilling between 1983 and 1990. The first town that came up on the list was the town of Oyster Bay in Nassau. Oyster Bay made its application to expand its landfill while it pursued a waste-to-energy contract that it hadn't yet signed. In that application, everything appeared to go well for Oyster Bay. There was a contested administrative hearing that was conducted by the administrative law judge for the state. It was contested by, the expansion was contested by some civic organizations, but the ALJ ruled in favor of the town. The ALJ said, all right, you're making progress, you're going to be expanding it, and there's really no feasible alternative for you because nobody on Long Island at that point in time was shipping waste anywhere else. The immediate effect of the law in every single town was to close its doors to any waste that wasn't generated within its borders. So Oyster Bay was not going to be able to go to Hempstead or Islip or Brookhaven or any place else because each of those towns was carefully keeping its capacity for its own citizens. But after the first application, the first decision by the ALJ went up to the commissioner reversed the ALJ. Commissioner of DEC said, no, you never demonstrated that you didn't have capacity you didn't have the capability or the feasibility to ship waste away, and we're denying your application. That was basically a 2x4 to the head that surprised everybody on Long Island. Oyster Bay had to look at shipping its waste off Long Island. Browning Ferris Industries stepped in and said, we can get rid of it for you, but it's going to cost you $115, $120 a ton. This was, I think in Oyster Bay's case, more than triple the tipping fee that it was looking at before that. And it looked to the island that this was going to be a fight to the death. Islip was up next. Islip began to prepare itself for a lengthy application and a lengthy fight because they could not see themselves paying the financial impact that the state's decision had mandated. We never found out when I was working on that application, we never found out what exactly the state's rationale was. Were they possibly not aware of the cost that they would make the towns subject to if they didn't get the expansion? Were they aware of it, but felt that whatever the cost was, it wasn't worth the risk of the threat to the aquifer, even though the landfill cell that they would construct would be lined? Or were they very well aware of the cost, but using the law as a political tool, as a political weapon? Because at the time in the 80s, every single town on Long Island was solidly Republican, and the state's governor was a Democrat, and the state's DEC commissioner was working for that governor. We never figured it out, but the bottom line was that both the state and the town were extremely stubborn. Neither was going to give up. The town and the state found themselves locked in a political, administrative, legal fight that began in 1985 and carried through to 1986. Plans 1 and Plans 2 were at loggerheads and were beginning a war that nobody knew where it was going to end up. Plan 3, though, there's another plan in place on Long Island, and this was the cartel. In the 1980s, everybody knew the cartel kind of existed, but nobody knew exactly how it worked. It was a kind of a world where if you wanted your garbage collected, if you, for instance, opened up a commercial business, you opened up a deli, you opened up a restaurant, you knew you needed to get your garbage collected, but who was going to do it? The answer is don't worry about it. If you wanted to get a guy to collect waste, and you went to the yellow pages and you went down the list and you picked a carting firm and you called them up and said, can you pick up, I'm opening up a new restaurant, this is my address, can you come and get my waste for me? Can you give me a price? That carter that you called up, the odds were he would tell you, me? Where are you? No, I probably can't help you. You have to call somebody else. He might tell you who to call, but he might not. You could call 9 other guys and you'd get the same answer until you called the right guy. The right guy was the guy that had been servicing the previous occupant of your building. That guy would give you a price. That guy would tell you, you could talk to him about how big of a container you wanted, but you could talk about the rate, but you weren't going to get anywhere with him. If you bought a house, a single-family house anywhere on Long Island, you really didn't have to call anybody because a carter would show up at your house and collect your waste, and a bill would come in the mail. But it was the kind of an atmosphere where nobody really understood which carter had your stop, and why you could pay this guy, but you couldn't get service from another guy. Excuse me. It was also the kind of a world where a couple of years later, when the battle against this cartel, progress had been made, but the war had not yet been won. Browning Ferris Industries opened up for business in the city of New York at the invitation of the mayor. Regional manager for BFI buys a house in Westchester County, and he's got a nice house. He's got a mailbox on the street in front of his house, one of those old-fashioned mailboxes where you have the flag and you pull down the front latch, and the mail is supposed to be inside. Regional manager goes to check his mailbox one day, shortly after he moves in. When he opens up the mailbox, inside the mailbox he finds the severed head of a dog. And in the dog's mouth is a note. And the note reads, "Welcome to New York." That's the message that the cartel sent to BFI to tell him what he's getting into. Okay, where do we get? What is the cartel, and how do we get there? Where did it come from? This is nothing new. This is not something that the Carters on Long Island invented. The cartel was ultimately the application of the principles of industrial labor racketeering. It goes back to Al Capone. It goes back to Chicago. It wasn't invented necessarily there, but in my view, it was really perfected there. And the principles that were established in Chicago in the 20s and 30s were adopted by other organized crime organizations around the country and applied. Al said, much can be accomplished with a smile, more can be accomplished with a smile and a gun. That was the principle that he operated by. And if you talk to cops, FBI guys, prosecutors, they will tell you that organized crime is not blessed with a lot of people that have a lot of intellect. They're mostly thugs, and a lot of them are killers. But every once in a while, there is somebody that comes along that has an unusual intellectual approach. And this is a guy who was one of those guys. Murray Humphreys. Murray Humphreys, born in Chicago, 1898. He is the only, this is a digression, but I got to give you Murray's background. He is the only known example of a Welsh gangster. He began his criminal career, or his Chicago career, at 7 years old selling newspapers on the street, when selling newspapers on the street was something that had some risk to it, and you had to fight for the right corner. He came under the supervision or guidance of a Chicago judge named John Murray when he was about 13 years old. John Murray, Judge Murray, thought he saw in Murray some potential. He tried to get him to apply his intellect and his talents in some legitimate way, and he taught him a lot about the law and about politics, Chicago style. It didn't take, but Murray appreciated it, and he changed his name after being under the influence of the judge, changed his first name to Murray. From then on, he was known as Murray Humphreys. His original name was Llewellyn Morris Humphreys, but going forward, he was known as Murray. The story is that in the early 20s, Murray was involved in a number of enterprises, one of which involved hijacking beer trucks. And one day he hijacked a Capone beer truck, and he was caught. And he was picked up, and he was brought back to meet Al Capone at one of Al's headquarters, probably at the Three Deuces in Cicero. He walked out. He didn't get carried out of that meeting feet first, but he stayed and he got a job from Al Capone as a result of that meeting. And Capone put him in charge of dealing with unions and labor, which the Chicago mob was trying to get their hands into. Murray had a 40-year career with organized crime in Chicago. He became the premier labor and industrial racketeer for the Chicago outfit, and he helped to develop the basic principles that organized crime would apply to union and industrial management racketeering going forward. He was known by a lot of nicknames. In the newspapers, he was known as the Hump or the Camel. Within the mob, he was called Mr. Moneybags, and he was called Einstein, but his friends called him Curly. He had a very kind of classic view of life, and he had a habit of, in his house, he would inscribe on pieces of wood like you could find in the gift shop at this hotel. If you go downstairs or you go down around the corner, there's always a piece of sliced pine with the bark on it, and on it you can have certain whatever kitschy saying you want to put on it. Murray would do this and hang these wall sayings up in his own house. Some of them were, as we have here, vote early and vote often, love thy crooked neighbor as they love thy crooked self, I refuse to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate me, and no citizen will testify in a court of law if he is convinced that to do so will result in his quick and certain death. The first one and the third one, vote early and vote often, and I refuse to answer on the ground that it might incriminate me, have to do with two of his salient pieces of advice and undertakings to the Chicago outfit over the years. I refuse to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate me refers to the advice that he gave to his bosses in the 40s when Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo were summoned to Washington to testify before Congress about the activities of organized crime in Chicago and elsewhere. He told them, don't say anything. Don't say a word. You take the fifth. Any question you get, you take the fifth. Tell them you're refusing to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate you. They won't like it, and they will hold you in contempt, but it won't stick. We'll go to court. We'll tell the court to vacate the sanction because you took the fifth. Murray was right. It was the first time anybody had taken the fifth before Congress, but it certainly wasn't the last. Vote early and vote often was another episode that Curley is credited with, and this is the election of John F. Kennedy to the presidency in 1960. Murray spent a week in a room at the Stevens Hotel in the week preceding the election, calling in every favor, mobilizing every union leader, bringing in every potential vote that the mob could generate in favor of JFK. Murray did this despite being in disagreement with Sam Giancana's choice of supporting JFK. Murray believed and agreed with Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa said, don't trust Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy wants you to support Jack. If you support Jack and he gets elected, he will put Bobby Kennedy in as Attorney General. And Bobby will not be good for us. You can't make a deal with Bobby. Bobby will come after us. Murray was right. Sam was wrong. But history is history. The other two that are there really go to the essence of Murray's philosophy with unions and with industry. Love thy crooked neighbor as they love thy crooked self. He believed that everybody could use a little extra income. Everybody is a little bit crooked. Everybody could be convinced, if it wasn't dangerous, to kind of look the other way or make an accommodation so that things would work smoothly. And he also believed that when push came to shove, no one is going to show up in court to testify if they're convinced that to do so will result in their quick and certain death. Now, the story about there's one story about the milk industry that kind of illustrates how Murray approached all of this. It's said that at some point in the later 20s, Murray came to Al Capone and said, Al, we're going to need new booze. We're going to need a new booze. This prohibition thing has been great for us, but it's going to get repealed. One of these days, they're going to pull it back, and everything is going to be back to legal sales of alcohol, and our little monopoly is going to be broken. What we need is something to replace booze. Al said, okay, what do you got in mind? Murray said, milk. Al said, milk? Murray said, think about it. Today, we sell our product to everybody, every man in the city, every working man in the city on Friday and Saturday night. The rest of the week, so-so. If we had the same control over milk that we have over booze, we would be selling our product to every family in the city 7 days a week. And they're going to be drinking it by the gallon. He said, well, how do you plan to go about this? Murray said, we already control the Milk Drivers Union. The Milk Drivers Union, what we're going to do there, we've got our people in there. We're going to expand membership. We're going to get our union working for every dairy that supplies the city. And we're going to demand better pay. And we're going to threaten to go out on strike. And we're going to press all of the dairies that employ drivers. Then we're going to use that pressure on the union, from the union on the dairies to organize the dairies. We're going to start up a trade association. And the trade association is going to join forces to negotiate with the union and resist the demands that they're going to be making for wages and for strikes and for benefits. And then we're going to make a compromise. And we're going to settle those labor disputes, and we're going to take money from both sides. So Murray's next step was to identify the biggest, most successful dairy that served the city of Chicago, find out who the president of the dairy was, and then have a car go by while he's walking down the street, snatch him up, kidnap him, take him to a location where he could have a candid conversation with him, and convince him that at the end of it all, this is going to be good for you. You're going to have labor peace. We're going to make a deal with the union. They're going to get a little bit more money, but you are also going to get a little bit more money. We're going to guarantee that nobody else is going to open up a new dairy in the city of Chicago. And Murray did this with the biggest dairy in town. He agreed. He did it with all the other 5 dairies serving the city. They all agreed. And once he had both an organized trade association and the union, he went to the city council and he bribed the city council to adopt a law that mandated the grading of milk. So grade A milk became in Chicago the law, and it was the product of an easy bribe to make. The city council mandated only grade A milk could be sold to the school children of the city. All of Murray's dairies produced grade A milk, and all of them increased their business, and no other dairy was going to start up and compete with that, with the trade association that Murray formed. Jump ahead 30 years, 50 years, to Long Island, 1986. This is how the cartel worked. The cartel controlled Teamsters Local 813. The Teamsters Local had always been controlled by the Gambino family. The cartel created the Private Sanitation Industry Association, PSIA. PSIA was controlled by the Lucchese crime family. The Teamsters and the Private Sanitation Industry Association enforced what was finally described as the property rights system. Under the property rights system, a carter's stop is a carter's property. If you served a location, if you served a home or a business, wherever it was yours. You could pass it down to your children, you could sell it. Nobody could poach that stop from you. It was your property. If anybody else, if you wanted to sell the stop, you could sell it. The fixed cost to purchase a stop, or if you wanted what that stop was worth to you, was generally 40 times the monthly rate that you billed. The monthly rate in New York was 3 times higher than the national average. No carter could enter the business, no other carter could enter the business without payment. Disputes could be arbitrated. If you had a disagreement about what was the value of a stop, but only to a point. And grand jury testimony, anybody wanted to talk about this to anybody outside of the cartel, that could get you killed, as it did to Carter's Robert Quebeca, Donald Barstow, on August 10th, 1989. The guy who was running the cartel, is this gentleman here, Sal Avellino Jr. Sal, as he was known to everybody, was pretty well known as being a presence in the industry. What exactly he did and how he did it was not really very well known. That was what the FBI was trying to find out. Ultimately, they did find out how the property rights system worked. But Sal was always the guy to talk to if you needed to get the industry to do something in terms of collecting waste. Sal was the guy who talked to the towns. He would sometimes talk to customers. He would always talk to the carters, and he was known to be in charge, kind of. But what he did, nobody really knew. He didn't really own a company, although his family did. He advised everybody that if you talk to him, he would show up as an advisor, a consultant. But in 1983 and 1984, the FBI was able to place a bug, a wiretap, in Sal's car. Sal drove a Jaguar. They were looking for information on how the cartel worked, but they got far, far more than they expected. Sal served also as the driver for Tony Corallo, Tony Ducks Corallo. Tony Ducks was called Tony Ducks because he was so good in his younger days at ducking criminal prosecutions. Sal and Tony began to talk about the commission. FBI kind of knew that there was such a thing, but nobody had any evidence of it. The bug placed in Sal's Jaguar was the first time that the federal government ever got any hard evidence that the commission actually existed and what it did. The bug in Sal's Jaguar has been called the most productive wiretap in the history of criminal prosecutions of organized crime. It spawned literally dozens of other racketeering investigations against other members of organized crime, other crime families. It touched on new rackets that were underway in the cement industry, in the windows industry, and miscellaneous rackets that were underway on Long Island in the early 80s. It was such an important bug and this is an aside. One day, the feds were happily listening away to the bug in Sal's car as he's driving around. But this particular day, he's not driving Tony Ducks. He's driving his son, his teenage son, Michael. And he tells Michael, Mike, your mother and I are going to Florida on Saturday. We're going down to Boca. We'll be there a week. While we're gone, you don't drive this car. This car stays in the garage. If you have somewhere to go, use your mother's car, right? I don't want this car on the street. It stays in the garage the whole time. Got it? Michael says, sure, Pop. Sal goes to Florida with Mom. What do you think happens? Saturday night, Michael and his buddy are in the Jaguar, zooming around Long Island. They get into a fender bender. They hear, the FBI is listening to all of this. They hear the crunch. They hear Michael's buddy saying, Mike, what do we do? What do we do? Your father's gonna kill us. Michael says, I know, wait. Hold it, I know a guy, he's got a body shop. We'll take the car to the body shop, we'll get him to fix it, and we'll get it done before my old man gets back. At the same time he's panicking, the FBI is panicking. The FBI is afraid that the body shop guy is gonna find the bug. They go to a federal judge, they get a warrant to break into the body shop, remove the bug from the Jaguar, put a new bug in the body shop to find out when the car is going to be fixed, then break into the body shop again when the work is done to put the bug back in the Jaguar and take the bug out of the body shop. Judge signs all these things, they do it, the car gets delivered to Michael, and at the same time that Michael, his buddy, and 9 FBI guys are all at the same time going, whew. That worked. That bug led to the commission trial in 1985 and 1986. In the commission trial that was brought by Rudy Giuliani and Michael Cherkasky, who was later our Commissioner of Homeland Security, it was the first time the heads of the 5 families in New York were all convicted at the same time. All of them got 100 years. It was viewed, they hoped, as a death blow, or at least a major setback to organized crime in New York. It all came out of the bug in the Jaguar. It didn't turn out that way right away, but ultimately it did, because the old guys went away, the young blood took over. Okay, Islip, going through its fight with the state. They lose, we lose. ALJ ruled for the state. The commissioner affirmed it. State court said, well, you know, Islip's argument is the state is kind of unreasonable, but not so unreasonable that we can overturn it or call it arbitrary and capricious because we're going to give deference to the commissioner to interpret the law. Islip is looking at closing the landfill in 6 months. Budget hearing comes along in October of 1986. Islip says, wait, this law doesn't require us to do anything. We have a landfill, we can close the landfill, we're gonna close it to commercial waste first. We're gonna tell all the businesses, all the school districts, all the apartment buildings, everybody who has been relying on that landfill that it's closed to them. And we're gonna leave it open to residences because we have made a promise to the residents. We've created a collection districts, and we got to provide them with disposal, and we're going to do that. If we do that, it's going to give us a full year, 1 more year to continue to fight in court. And we gave Islip gave its carters 30 days, find a place to go. Who did they have to go to find a place where to take it? DEC. So I figured, well, you guys, it's time you met. You ask DEC, DEC will give you a place to go. They started it. They started shipping waste. They went for a month or two, but in January of 1987, a guy named Lowell Harrison comes to Sal Avellino and says, Sal, I can arrange for a barge to take the garbage that you guys are shipping and get it down to North Carolina for pennies a ton. Much, much cheaper than you're going to spend running it down there in trucks or any place else you're going in trucks. Sal he's interested. Sal gives Lowell $300,000 for a pilot project that Lowell says he's going to be able to make work in North Carolina. March 1987, a barge is delivered to a dock in Long Island City, and Tommy Giswally, running the transfer station, loads it up with garbage. 80% of that garbage is probably coming from the Lucchese family, but every other crime family in New York has a token amount that they can put on. My guess was 5% Gambinos, 5% Genovese, 5% Colombos, and 5% Bananos, but off it went. March 22nd, the Marlboro left New York. Next stop, Morehead City, North Carolina. There he goes, away and away it goes. But the world was about to meet the barge. Got to North Carolina said no. Then a video got out of the barge sitting in the harbor at North Carolina and then turning around and going out to sea. At this point, Johnny Carson finds out about it. Johnny Carson opens up his monologue on the barge. Johnny Carson, at that point in time, 1987, 18 million people were listening to Johnny when he did his monologue every night. Today, the guys who are doing late night shows, if they get 2 or 3 million, it's a lot, but everybody listened to Johnny.
Barge up into the Gulf of Persia, and there is Iran. Dump it right there.
That's Johnny's answer for the barge. This is where the barge went. It sailed all the way around from North Carolina, around Florida, tried to go up into Mississippi and find a landfill there. It was rejected by Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Mexico, Belize, and Florida. The Mississippi National Guard lined the banks of the river to keep it from unloading. The Mexican Air Force buzzed the barge, all to say no means no. This was a happening. The newspapers covered it, the TV covered it, Newsday ran every single day. This is day 22 of the barge. Where is it? Day 23, day 24. Ultimately, it got to be day 120. But everybody was watching this barge as it wandered about trying to find a home. Ultimately, it ended up going back to New York and anchoring off Brooklyn. In Washington, the barge attracted the attention of a Senate committee. At the time, the Senate was fully engaged in the Iran-Contra hearings, but there were about a dozen senators that weren't involved in that, and they decided to hold a series of hearings on the barge. They did. They invited the DEC commissioner and ISLIP's supervisor down to testify. But after the Carson monologue, and after all the press that was going on, the narrative about the barge started to change. Before the barge left, nobody really was paying much attention to ISLIP or its shipment, and the press was treating ISLIP as kind of like they're polluters, the bad guys. The state is only doing its job, closing these landfills and getting the waste taken care of somewhere. It's not really their problem. But after Carson, and after the barge started to show up on TV screens and kind of inch up the Mississippi River, get sent back down again, kind of linger off Texas, linger off Florida, go to Mexico, go to Belize, and get rejected, the narrative started to change. Suddenly, it wasn't so much ISLIP being the bad guy, it was New York State being the entity that was exporting ISLIP's garbage problem to someplace else. Not New York, but some other state, first North Carolina. And the senators were upset about this. In the hearings, the senators gave the commissioner a much harder time than they gave the ISLIP supervisor. And ISLIP had been lobbying these senators pretty heavily to get them to do that. Something else happened in the middle of this, which was the presidential election was coming up. This is 1987. That week, same day that the hearings were held, Gary Hart was the leading contender for the Democratic nomination, and he had the monkey business in Miami. His picture was taken on a boat. On the same day that the hearings were held, Gary Hart got out of the presidential race, and by 6 o'clock that night, Governor Mario Cuomo was now the leading contender for the Democratic nomination. Frank Jones, Henry Williams took the train back to New York that Thursday night together and talked about what was going on. The next day, the barge, meanwhile, is waiting off Brooklyn. The next day, Frank, the commissioner, invites ISLIP up to New York, up to Albany to talk about how to get rid of it. After the barge, the pursuit of the cartel continued, and we had a lot of things. I'm going to have to, I think, skip this because suffice it to say, after the commission trial, Tony Ducks put a couple of guys named Vic Amuso and Anthony Gaspipe Casso in charge of the Lucchese crime family. They had a little extra power, a little extra something in Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito, who were New York City detectives, who tipped them off when they were about to be arrested and committed any number of murders, including setting up the murder of Donald Barstow and Robert Kubica. I've got to wrap up here, they're telling me. ultimately, the feds, Robert Kuvecka got killed a day or two before he was supposed to testify in front of a grand jury. Vic Amuso and Anthony Casso took over. They ran off to the woods when they were about to be indicted for the Windows case. Eppolito and Caracappa were in the process of working to try to kill this guy, Pete Chiodo, and that guy, Al Diarco, who was left in charge. There were at least 10 killings while Musso and Casso were out in the woods. They were finally caught. Casso flipped. He flipped in Caracappa and Eppolito. Avellino was convicted of conspiracy to murder the Quebecas, and the Eastern District filed a civil RICO action that ultimately cleaned up the garbage business. And I have to run right through all this as quick as I can. 112 defendants, 44 corporations. The industry was cleaned up when Diarco, Chiodo, and half a dozen other guys, because of Musso and Caracappa, were trying to kill anyone who was suspected of being an informant or suspected of being cheating the family out of its rightful money. People started to flip. And Al Diarco was the guy who did something that no other witness in the history of organized crime prosecution ever did. He kept notes. He kept notes on how much money the family was supposed to be getting from different rackets, and his testimony tied it all together. The barge was settled by the state and the town on May 11 and May 12, 1987. By that time, the state and the town both understood that this had to end. The state finally changed its mind. We came up with a plan. We said we're not going to expand laterally, we'll expand vertically. You give us an extra 50 feet of a new cell, a piggyback landfill cell over the old one. We'll build that. We did build that. It was the first time it was ever done. The barge waste was burned in Brooklyn. The Islip landfill got a new extension. The waste-to-energy plant was built. Peace was made. 3 more waste-to-energy facilities. And nationally, curbside recycling kept going. At the end of it all, this is a graph that the EPA put out some years later. It's where you see the Mobro. You can see that recycling, curbside recycling, was starting to grow before the Mobro, but after. Would we have gotten that spike in recycling as quickly as we did in any other way? I don't know. But what's clear is, were it not for the state fighting with the town would not have closed its landfill to commercial waste, and the closure of the commercial waste would not have led Sal to get into the business of shipping waste, and the barge would not have showed up. Were it not for the cartel, there wouldn't have been a single ounce of garbage that went onto that barge, and that barge would not have set sail. Were it not for Lowell Harrison, who knows what he had ready, or what he thought he had in North Carolina, but it didn't pan out. Were it not for all of that, the barge would not have gotten the attention it got, and recycling may not have gotten to where it was after that. I would like to be able to give you more detail about how the feds actually got the cartel, what it all meant, and what everybody, what penalties everybody paid in all of this, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to end. I would very much like to thank you all for this, and if you have any questions about it, and I'm sure you do because of all I had to leave out, you can please try to get them to me in some way, and I will try to get answers for you. But it was my pleasure to give you the actual story of the Garbage Barge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, brother. I'll take that. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Cahill, our 2018 Lawrence Lecturer Fellowship. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, guys.